Now, this week's elections across the United States are still being analyzed. One local issue with broader ramifications is in California, the first recall of a judge there in almost 90 years. It began with the rape of a Stanford University student and the judge's sentencing of her attacker. People were outraged that the man was sent to jail for only 6 months. Arise News' Duarte Geraldino reports some legal scholars are now warning that this judge's ouster is shaking the integrity of California courts.
Judge Aaron Persky is the only U.S. judge to be kicked off the bench since 1977. In the weeks before the recall, he warned voters.
This is the political playbook for those who want to oust judges, whether it be at the trial court on a recall or whether it be a state Supreme Court justice. It's the politics of fear. It's to appeal to the public's fear of crime.
More than 59% of voters said yes to recalling a judge after a controversial 2016 sentencing. The case involved an unconscious Stanford University student who was raped behind a dumpster. A judge found former Stanford student Brock Turner guilty of 3 felonies: sexual penetration with a foreign object of an intoxicated person, sexual penetration with a foreign object of an unconscious person, and intent to commit rape. 3 crimes that carried a maximum sentence of 14 years. Persky sentenced Brock to 6 months in county jail. In the end, he only served 3 months. Brock was a swimmer at Stanford. He's white, a first-time offender. His parents could afford a private attorney. All facts that many believe influenced the judge to show the convicted attacker leniency.
In the age of the Me Too movement, critics raised $1 million and campaigned to get Persky kicked off the bench. They won. They claimed bias and white male favoritism, but Persky found an unlikely supporter, an African-American woman, former Santa Clara County Judge Lodoris Cordell.
Cordell argues this recall may actually hurt poor defendants and people of color because it sends a message to judges: consider public opinion or risk being fired by displeased voters. She explained her view during a May 8th press conference.
They know that this recall is a threat to judicial independence and that their vindictive attempt to recall Judge Persky is pulling us back into the world of mandatory minimum prison sentences that resulted in mass incarceration of the poor and people of color.
A white woman is replacing Persky. Judge Cindy Seeley Hendrickson has been a Santa Clara County prosecutor since 1995. The campaign to recall Persky endorsed her. For Arise America, Duarte Geraldino.
Now, the controversy over the judge in California focuses on a key source of tension in American life. It's about how the United States legal system values the lives of women and people of color, or rather devalues them. In California, it was about a woman, but ever since the Black Lives Matter movement erupted in response to the police killings of black men, there's been an increasing uproar over inequalities in the criminal justice system. It's why athletes are kneeling on football fields, and it's why even NBA championship winners are refusing to go to the White House after a victory. Well, Clarence Lusane chairs the Department of Political Science at Howard University, and he's been following these issues closely. Many thanks for joining us, Professor. Voters in California just kicked Judge Aaron Persky off the bench. This is the first time this has happened in the U.S. since 1977. They were clearly angered by the fact that the Stanford student was caught raping a drunk student by a dumpster, and this judge only sentenced him to 6 months. I mean, how did the value of their lives play out in this case?
Yeah, I think that it was a fair outcome to remove this judge. The people spoke, and they spoke clearly. It was not even close. It was 60% versus 40% in terms of the vote. I think people were outraged because this really was an egregious injustice by giving this young man only basically 3 months. This was a young woman who was unconscious. She had no opportunity to resist. And only because he was discovered by students who were passing that he stopped. Now, this is a long-standing issue of disparities in the sentences that happen to young men of color in these circumstances and to young white men. This judge that was involved in this case, Judge Persky, had a similar case not that long after the Turner case of a young Latino man, Raul Ramirez, almost exactly the same situation, and he ended up with 3 years in prison.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that Judge Persky had an unlikely supporter. LaDoris Cordell is not only a former Santa Clara County judge, but she's also black. I mean, she argues recalling this judge is a threat to judicial independence. I mean, do you agree with that?
No, I think she's right. Judicial independence is an extremely important principle in democracy. For example, I think the attacks by President Donald Trump on the judiciary really are a problem. However, you can't have a situation where a judge acts in such an egregious way and that the justice system and the court system essentially lets him get away with it. So the only recourse for addressing that particular outrage was to do this recall. I don't think it means that we will see recalls happening every other month. This took years of work. It took over $1 million. So it really did reflect that there was a broad feeling among the voters that this should happen. But I don't think, as the judge fears, that this will lead to an avalanche of these kinds of recall operations.
Well, LaDoris goes further to say that the success of the recall campaign could lead to mandatory sentences which disproportionately hurt indigent inmates and people of color. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, just a little bit of history. The call for mandatory minimums going back to the 1980s came out of a progressive thrust because it was felt by civil liberties organizations, civil rights groups, that judges had too much discretion and that judges were, in this sense, and there were studies to back it up, were disproportionately sentencing young African Americans and young Latinos to much harsher sentences using their discretions. So the call for mandatory minimums was put in, and the implementation was to try to address that problem. But guess what? The problem did not go away because there are other means by which judges were able to get around even the mandatory minimums, and in fact, there was even more disproportionate sentencing of young African Americans and young Latinos. There's a study that just came out a few weeks ago from Harvard Law School that showed that Republican appointed judges appointed by Republican presidents, tend to give on average 6 to 9 months longer sentences for African American defendants. But Democratic judges tend to give 3 to 5 months longer sentences. So regardless of whether it's a Democrat appointed judge or a Republican appointed judge, the outcome is that there's disproportionate longer sentences for young men of color. So that really is the issue. Mandatory minimums or not mandatory minimums can't obscure that this kind of systemic and institutional discrimination continues, and that really needs to be addressed. I don't think that the message from this recall is that the independence of the judiciary is threatened. I think the message is that judges that act in ways that are over the line have to have accountability.
Well, let's turn to the White House and that controversy that's been brewing between professional athletes and President Trump. A growing number of players are refusing to set foot in the White House in response to Mr. Trump's suggestion that team owners should fire players who take the knee during the national anthem. I mean, what does this controversy say about how black lives are valued in the U.S.?
Yeah, this is so disingenuous by the president The issue is not and has never been about whether the flag or the national anthem or the country is being disrespected. The movement by Colin Kaepernick, these athletes who have supported his cause and Black Lives Matter and civil rights organizations, is that there has been a unrelenting killing of young black people, not necessarily young, but black people by police, and that has to be raised to the consciousness of the country and addressed. This has nothing to do with pardoning individuals who went to jail on charges that were unfair. That is an issue that should be addressed, but that's not what's being protested by the athletes. What's being protested is Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old who was killed by police who did not stop to see if he was armed and gunned him down. Eric Gardner, who was choked to death by the police in New York City for trying to simply sell cigarettes. By Scott in South Carolina, who was shot in the back while running away, and then the police officer attempted to frame him. So it's those kind of cases that the protests have been attempting to deal with.
Very briefly, Dr. Lusane, there are many sports fans who support Mr. Trump. Are his comments effectively a dog whistle to his voter base?
Oh, it certainly is. One of the NFL owners, yes, I'm saying one of the owners essentially said that Donald Trump told him that this is a winning issue with his base. So every time there's an opportunity for Donald Trump to make this false linkage between the NFL players and other players' protests and the national anthem, he takes advantage of that, although the two are unrelated.
To Lusane, I want to say an exceeding thank you to you for joining us. Professor Clarence Lusane, of course, of Howard University. We'll be back with business news when Arise America continues.